She had no land, no money, no name worth mentioning in Red Hollow's parlors. Eliza Hart was the kind of woman people looked through. The seamstress in the corner, the quiet one with flour-dusted fingers and a needle always between her teeth. When the most powerful rancher in the territory chose her over every wealthy widow who'd been circling him for years, the town didn't just gossip. They organized. They schemed. They tried to destroy her. What followed wasn't a love story the frontier was prepared for. It was a war. And the woman everyone underestimated was the one holding the only weapon that mattered. The dust storm rolled in from the northwest like something with a grudge. It came fast, the way the worst things always did out on the high plains. One moment the sky was a flat, ordinary blue, and the next it had turned the color of dried blood. A wall of grit and wind roaring toward Red Hollow, with enough force to strip paint off barn doors and send chickens tumbling end over end across the yard. People ran. They shuttered windows and stuffed rags under doors, and cursed the season and the land and whatever combination of bad luck had placed them in this particular valley at this particular time. Cole Mercer didn't run. He stood at the edge of the main street with his hat pulled low and his shoulders set square against the approaching wall of brown air, watching it come the way a man watches something he's seen before and survived before and will probably survive again. Around him, Red Hollow was erupting into the practiced chaos of storm preparation. Shop owners yanking their hanging signs down from above their doorways, the smithy's apprentice wrestling a loose shutter that kept banging against the wall, Mrs. Linden from the dry goods store screaming at her nephew to bring the barrel of oat flour inside before it was ruined. Cole didn't help with any of it. Not because he was callous. He was watching the storm line, reading the angle of the dirt wall the way an old sailor reads a wave, calculating how bad it was going to be and how long it was going to last. It was a habit from years of living alone on land that didn't care whether you were prepared or not. The land had its own schedule, and you either learned to read it or you didn't last. When the storm hit, it hit like a fist. The wind knocked him sideways, not off his feet, but sideways, his boots grinding into the packed dirt of the street as he leaned hard into it. Grit peppered his face. His eyes snapped shut. He kept walking, head down, moving toward where he'd tied his horse at the post outside the hardware store. Because the animal would be panicking by now, and a panicking horse tied to a post could damage itself badly. He was halfway there when the hat left his head. It wasn't a gradual thing. 1 second it was on his head, pressed down as far as it would go, and then a gust hit at an angle and it was simply gone, tumbling off down the street, disappearing into the brown murk of the storm before he could grab for it. He swore, one short, private word, and kept moving toward the horse. The horse was fine, nervous, stamping and blowing, but the rope had held. Cole stood with his hand on the animal's neck and talked low to it. Not words exactly, more like sounds, until the worst of the storm settled into something manageable, the kind of steady, hard wind that you could walk through without being thrown. He got the horse into the lean-to behind the hardware store, made sure it had water, and then stood in the doorway of the lean-to, watching the town emerge from its various hiding places as the storm began to ease. He didn't think about the hat. It was gone. He'd get another one. Bow. He found it 3 days later, or rather, it found him in a way, because he didn't go looking. He was on his way to pick up a saddle repair from the leather worker on the east side of town, walking down the alley that ran behind the row of small shops and workrooms, when a voice said, "Excuse me." He stopped. The voice had come from a doorway, a narrow wooden door set into the back of a building that he vaguely knew to be a seamstress's workroom. In the doorway stood a woman he didn't recognize, which surprised him slightly. He thought he knew most people in Red Hollow by sight, if not by name, but he couldn't place her. She wasn't tall. She wasn't the kind of woman who came into a room and stopped conversations. She had dark hair pinned back in a practical way, no frills about it, and she was wearing an apron over a plain gray dress. The apron had thread stuck to it in 3 different colors. Her hands, he noticed, were calloused in the peculiar way of needlework, the kind of callousing that built up at specific points on the fingers where thread and thimble pressed repeatedly over years. She was looking at him steadily, not nervously, which was different from how most people looked at him. Most people in Red Hollow looked at Cole Mercer with a certain performative deference, aware of who he was, aware of what his land and his reputation represented in the local economy. This woman just looked at him like he was a person who had stopped in front of her door. "Your hat," she said. She held it out. He took it automatically, turning it over in his hands. It was his hat. He recognized the sweat stain on the inside band and the small nick in the brim that he'd made 2 summers ago on a fence wire. But it was different than he'd last seen it. The storm had done something violent to it. He remembered seeing it tumble away and assuming it was finished. But someone had worked on it. The torn section in the crown had been stitched, not invisibly, but competently, with thread that came close enough to the original color that you had to look for it to see it. The bent brim had been steamed back into shape, or close to it. The hat looked like it had been through a fight, which it had, but it looked like someone had bothered to put it back together afterward. "I found it near the feed store," the woman said. "Recognized it. I've seen you wear it." Cole looked up from the hat. "Thank you," he said. "What do I owe you?" She shook her head slightly. "Nothing. It wasn't much work. It was some work. Not enough to charge for." She didn't say it with false modesty or to invite him to insist. She said it the way someone states a fact. He put the hat on his head. It fit differently than before the storm. Not badly, just differently, like something that had been broken and reset at a slightly different angle. He thought it might actually be better than before. The brim had always sat a little too flat in the front. "I'm Cole Mercer," he said, because it seemed wrong to take something from someone without at least introducing himself. "I know who you are," she said, not rudely, just plainly. "I don't know you," he said. "Eliza Hart. I've been here 2 years." She said it without accusation, just as a piece of information. She'd been here 2 years, and he'd never learned her name, and they both understood that this said more about the rhythms of his particular life than about any rudeness on his part. 2 years, he repeated. He felt, for a reason he couldn't have explained, slightly embarrassed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mercer." She stepped back into her workroom and closed the door. Not rudely, just done with the conversation. He stood in the alley for a moment with his repaired hat on his head, and then he walked on to collect his saddle. He thought about her on the ride home. Not romantically, or not exactly. He thought about her the way you think about something that doesn't fit into the category you expected it to fit into. He was accustomed to people responding to him in predictable ways. Red Hollow had been his territory for long enough that he'd come to know the particular social gravity his name and his land produced, the slight straightening of posture when people saw him, the careful conversational deference, the way invitations to dinner materialized out of nowhere every few months, always from families with unmarried daughters or recently widowed mothers. He didn't like it, but he'd gotten used to it. Eliza Hart had not done any of that. She'd handed him his hat and stated a fact and gone back inside her workroom. She'd treated him like a stranger who'd briefly needed something, and having provided it, she'd returned to her own work. It stayed with him, the way small, unexplained things sometimes do. Gemasikт. Cole's ranch sat on the northwest side of the valley, 800 acres of grass and rock and creek-cut ravines that he'd been building up since he was 23 years old. The main house was stone and timber, built to last rather than to impress, with a wide porch that ran the length of the front face and looked out over the lower pastures where he kept his cattle in the seasons when the upper range was too cold. He had 4 hands. Dean, who'd been with him for 11 years and functioned less as an employee than as a semi-permanent piece of the property. 2 brothers named Gus and Harlow, who had come together 3 years ago and seemed constitutionally incapable of arriving anywhere separately. And a young man named Trace who'd showed up asking for work the previous spring and turned out to know considerably more about cattle than his age suggested. It was not a lonely life, exactly, but it was a particular life, narrow and governed by weather and livestock prices and the specific demands of land that didn't manage itself. Cole had built it deliberately. After his father's death 12 years ago had left him the ranch and a collection of debts that had taken 6 years to pay down, he'd kept his world small by choice. He trusted what he could see and work and fix with his hands. Everything else was noise. The women his neighbors kept suggesting to him were noise. He had nothing against any of them personally. The widows especially. He understood their situation well enough, the particular vulnerability of a woman alone on the frontier with land, but not enough hands to work it, looking at a man with resources and seeing a solution rather than a person. He understood it because he'd seen his mother navigate something similar after his father got sick. The way she'd had to calculate every social interaction for its practical consequence. He didn't blame them. He just didn't want it. He didn't want a transaction dressed up as a courtship. What he wanted, in the rare moments when he let himself think about it, was something he'd never been able to define precisely. Not beauty. He'd known beautiful women who made him feel nothing. Not ambition. He had enough of his own. Something quieter. Something honest. He thought, on the ride home from town, that Eliza Hart had an honesty to her that he couldn't put words around. The way she'd said, "I know who you are," and it wasn't much work. No performance in either statement. Just two facts, plainly delivered. He made dinner, ate it standing over the kitchen counter, the way he usually did when he cooked just for himself, and went to bed. Done. He went back to town 2 weeks later for a load of wire fencing, and he walked past the seamstress's alley without stopping and then turned around and went back. The back door was open this time. Through it he could hear the sound of scissors, a clean, repetitive sound, cloth moving on a table. He knocked on the doorframe. The sound stopped. "Mr. Mercer." She recognized him. Of course she recognized him. He was Cole Mercer. She'd just said she'd known who he was. But something about hearing her say his name made him feel unexpectedly off balance. The way stepping onto ground you expect it to be solid and finding it slightly soft will throw off your stride. "I owe you for the hat," he said. "I said you didn't." "I know what you said." He pulled off the hat, the repaired one, which he'd worn every day since, and turned it over. "I've been thinking about it, and it was work. I want to pay for it." She looked at him for a moment. She was sitting at a work table with a length of dark wool spread out in front of her, a pattern pinned to it with small metal pins. Her hair was up in the same practical way as before. She had a small smudge of chalk on her jaw where she must have rested her face on her hand while leaning over the table. "Then pay me what you think is fair," she said. "Though I'll tell you right now that if you hand me a gold coin for a hat repair, I'll be annoyed." He laughed. He didn't laugh easily. Dean had once told him, in the plain-spoken way that 11 years of mutual respect permitted, that he had the laugh of a man who'd forgotten he was allowed to use it. But something about the specificity of her annoyance, not a general annoyance, a gold coin for a hat repair annoyance, surprised it out of him. "I wasn't going to give you a gold coin," he said. "Good." He set 2 bits on the corner of her table. She looked at the coins, then at him. "That's fair," she said. "Thank you," he said. He put his hat back on. He should have left. Instead, he said, "What are you making?" She glanced down at the dark wool. "A coat. Metzger's order. He needs it before the cold comes in." "You do most of the tailoring in town?" "Most of it. Mrs. Beaumont does the fancy work. The wedding dresses, the parlor curtains. I do the coats and the working clothes. The things people actually use." There was no bitterness in it, just a practical cataloging of the division of labor. Cole looked around the workroom. It was small and crowded the way useful spaces tend to be. Thread organized on a wooden rack along one wall, folded fabric stacked on shelves, a dress form in the corner wearing half a finished jacket. The whole room smelled like cut cloth and beeswax. There was a small wood stove in the corner that was doing its job, and a window above the work table that gave good light. "You've been here 2 years, Tikiya," he said. 2 years in Red Hollow, 7 years at the trade. "Where before?" She picked up her scissors. Kentfield, before that Sorrow's Bend, before that a place that doesn't exist anymore. She said it without drama, but he heard the shape of something in it, the kind of compact sentence that contains a longer story that the speaker has decided not to tell. "I'm sorry, Ki," he said, because it seemed like the right thing, and he meant it. "Don't be. I got out." She said it simply and went back to her cutting. He left. He came back 3 days later on no particular errand. What? It became a thing that happened, not a courtship, not in the formal sense that Red Hollow would have recognized. No calling at the front door with his hat in his hands, no flowers, no formal declaration of intent. He was a man who moved slowly and thought carefully, and she was a woman who, he was coming to understand, had learned to be careful about what she trusted and why. So they moved slowly together, without ever quite agreeing that they were moving at all. He would stop at the workroom door, she would let him in, or tell him she was too busy. When she let him in, they talked about the weather, because the weather mattered out here in ways that people who'd grown up in cities never quite grasped. about cattle, which she knew more about than he expected, about the town, about the people in it, about the slow grinding machinery of a small community that ran on gossip and mutual dependency in roughly equal measure. She was direct, but not sharp. She said what she thought without softening it into something diplomatic, but there was no cruelty in her directness. She simply saw little point in saying things she didn't mean. He liked that. He found it resting after years of navigating the heavily coded social landscape of Red Hollow, where everyone seemed to say three things at once, and the real meaning was always the one underneath. She was also funny, in a dry and understated way. She once described a visiting cattle buyer's attempt to negotiate down the price of a jacket as a man arguing with arithmetic, and the phrase stuck with him for days because it was so precisely right. He liked watching her work. She had a craftsman's absorption in her task. When she was cutting or stitching, the rest of the room fell away from her attention without her having to deliberately ignore it. He respected that. He was the same way with land and livestock, the way the world simplified down to the specific problem in front of him when he was truly focused. It was, he thought, one of the forms that competence took in a person. The ability to disappear into the work. What he noticed over the weeks of these irregular visits was what she didn't do. She didn't arrange herself for him. She didn't perform. She was in her workroom, exactly the same as she would be if he weren't there, adjusted only slightly for the social fact of his presence. She didn't fish for compliments or manufacture crises that might require his assistance. She didn't, in the subtle way that several women of his acquaintance had done, remind him periodically of how useful she could be to a man in his position. She was just there, making things, saying what she thought, occasionally telling him he was in the way of the light. He wasn't used to it. He found it was what he wanted. The town noticed before either of them acknowledged what was happening. Red Hollow was not a large town, and it was the kind of not large town where the social architecture was well established, and the players within it had a clear sense of the hierarchies that governed everything from who got credit at the bank to whose children married whose. Cole Mercer was near the top of that architecture, not by wealth alone, though the Mercer Ranch was one of the larger operations in the valley, but by something less tangible, a reputation built over years of hard decisions and survived hardships that had made him a point of reference for the community's sense of what the frontier required of a man. That position had made him a target for a certain category of social ambition. The Caldwell women were the most organized about it. Iris Caldwell was a widow in her late 30s who had inherited her late husband's considerable dry goods business and expanded it shrewdly in the 2 years since his death. She was handsome and sharp and genuinely competent, and she'd decided, with the same methodical efficiency she applied to her business affairs, that Cole Mercer would make an excellent second husband. Her daughter from her first marriage was 19 and recently widowed herself, a circumstance that had not been of her own making, her husband having died of a fever the previous winter. And Iris had broader plans that involved the daughter as well, plans in which the Mercer Ranch figured as an important piece of real estate. She was not alone in these ambitions. Vera Marsh, whose late husband had been a grain merchant, had a similar assessment of the situation. So did Harriet Dale, who was not a widow but a never-married woman of considerable property and no patience for subtlety, who had made her interest in Cole known to him directly on 2 separate occasions and had apparently decided that his polite refusals were a form of modesty to be overcome rather than a genuine expression of preference. These women had not previously regarded each other as allies. They competed, in fact, in the regular way of socially ambitious people in close proximity. But Cole Mercer's apparent interest in a seamstress brought them into unexpected and temporary agreement. The first Cole heard of it directly was from Dean, who had been in town for supplies and had come back with the particular expression of a man who has information he's been asked not to share and is going to share it anyway. "Town's talking," Dean said, pouring himself coffee at the kitchen counter. "Town's always talking," Cole said. "Town's talking about you and the seamstress." Cole didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at the map on the kitchen table, a survey map of the valley that he'd been using to think through the summer grazing rotation. He moved a tin cup that was holding down one corner. "What are they saying?" Mrs. Caldwell had a word with Pastor Hines about community standards. Dean said community standards the way you say a phrase you're quoting from someone else, with the slight quotation marks of a man who finds the phrase ridiculous. Mrs. Marsh told half the women's auxiliary that Miss Hart was above herself. Cole looked up. She hasn't been above anything. She fixed my hat, and I've talked to her a few times. Dean gave him a look that conveyed, without rudeness, that Dean had known him for 11 years and was not fooled by this characterization. I'm just telling you what's being said, Dean said. Cole went back to the map. After a moment he said, Is she getting trouble in town? Some, Dean said. Henderson's boy told me the mercantile's been slow filling her supply orders. Cloth she's been getting regular for 2 years suddenly takes twice as long. He paused. She hasn't said anything? Not to me. Dean drank his coffee. She probably wouldn't. That was accurate. Cole understood it immediately. It was consistent with everything he knew about how Eliza Hart operated. She would see it as her problem to manage, not something to bring to him, partly because she was not the kind of person who demanded rescue, and partly because she would know that coming to him with it would make it a different kind of thing, a thing that obligated him in ways she hadn't asked for. He thought about that on his own terms and found it simultaneously admirable and frustrating. He went to see her the next morning. She was in the front section of her workspace. She had a small room at the front that faced the street, with a window and a little counter where she took in orders and the actual workroom behind it. He came in the front door for the first time, which he realized as he did it was itself a statement of intent, arriving through the front of the shop rather than the workroom alley. But the front door was where customers came, and he told himself he had a practical reason for this visit. She looked up from the counter. She had a small ledger open and had been writing in it, and the pen was still in her hand. Mr. Mercer, are Callum's at the mercantile giving you trouble with supply orders? She set down the pen. Her expression didn't change in any way he could read clearly, but something in it stilled. Where did you hear that? Doesn't matter. Are they? She was quiet for a moment. He could see her assessing the question, its source, its intent, what answering it might imply or commit her to. Some orders have been slow, she said, choosing her words carefully. I've managed. You shouldn't have to manage it. Things are being made difficult for you too, I'd imagine, she said, and her voice was level, not asking for anything, just naming a fact. The Caldwell woman has been at you, hasn't she? She's been at me since before her husband was cold. That's not new. Eliza looked at him. She had the still, considered look she got when she was processing something. He'd come to know that expression, the slight concentration around the eyes. I don't want to be the reason for complications in your life, she said. You're not the reason. I might be contributing to them. Eliza. He said her name, which he hadn't done often. They'd stayed on a last name formality that felt appropriate to the early stages of whatever they were. He saw her react slightly to it, a small thing, a micro-adjustment of her attention. The complications in my life are mostly ones I've already chosen. I don't ask other people to manage that. She was quiet again. Then, I'll need a bolt of blue wool and 2 spools of the heavyweight thread. The mercantile order's been sitting for 11 days. I'll talk to Callum. I don't need you to fix it. I'm not fixing it for you. I'm talking to a man about his business practices, which is the kind of thing I do. She looked at him for a long moment. Something passed across her face that was almost, but not quite, a smile. All right, she said. 11 days, blue wool and heavyweight thread. He left. He talked to Callum that afternoon. He did it quietly and without theatrics. He simply pointed out that he was aware of the delay, that he'd been a reliable customer at that store for 9 years, and that he wondered if there was anything in the store's supply management that needed attention. Callum, who was not a stupid man and understood perfectly well what this conversation was about, had the order filled by the following morning. Cole didn't tell Eliza how the conversation had gone. He didn't need to. When she received her wool and her thread, she would know. That seemed like enough. The summer was hot and long, and the creek that fed the upper pastures ran lower than Cole had seen it in years. He noticed it first in June, when the water level dropped a full foot below where it usually stood at this point in the season. He walked the creek line for half a day, looking at the banks, reading the ground, trying to understand what he was seeing. The water was clear enough, no obvious upstream diversion, but the volume was simply down. He thought about the winter snowpack, which had been lean, and the spring, which had come early and dry, and tried to calculate in his head what the next 3 months might look like if the trend continued. He was standing at the upper bend in the creek, doing this mental arithmetic and not liking the results, when he heard footsteps on the bank behind him. He turned. Eliza was picking her way down the rocky slope from the old wagon road, holding her skirts up from the scrub. She'd come out 3 times now to the ranch, twice on practical errands, once because he'd asked her if she'd like to see the upper pastures, and she'd said she'd like to. She moved carefully on the rough ground, not gracefully, but with the competence of someone who'd grown up around terrain that required attention and hadn't forgotten the lesson. "Creek's down," she said when she reached him, looking at the water, "about a foot from where it should be." She crouched down at the bank and stuck her fingers in the water. He didn't know why. Testing the temperature maybe, or just feeling the current. "How many head do you have on the upper range right now?" "About 90. I'll need to bring them down in 4 weeks regardless. If the creek drops much more, I might need to do it in 2. Early grazing on the lower pastures. Compresses the season. Means I'm buying feed by October." She stood up, wiping her wet fingers on her apron. She was looking upstream, squinting slightly against the afternoon light. "Where does this originate?" "Up in the Whitmore Basin. There's snowmelt that feeds it all summer normally." He paused. "Normally. Is anyone else losing water?" "Grayson's been complaining about his stock pond. Heller said his southeast draw ran dry last month. It's not just me." He was quiet for a moment. If the summer stays dry, this valley is going to have a serious problem. She was quiet too, looking at the creek. He watched her face, the focused expression she got when she was working through something, the slight narrowing of the eyes. "There's an old reservoir up in the Whitmore Basin," she said. "Harker's Reservoir. Someone told me about it when I first came to town." He knew the name. "Hasn't been used in 30 years, got damaged in a storm, the access trail washed out. But the structure itself is intact." "I don't know. No one's been up there since before I came to this valley." She looked at him. "If it's intact, and if the trail could be cleared, it would hold water from the snowmelt and release it controlled through the summer. It's not a small project." "No," she agreed, "but neither is buying feed for 90 head from October through March." He looked at the creek, then at her. She was practical, he thought, not in the way that people meant it when they used the word as a polite way of saying unimaginative, practical in the way of a person who had learned through experience to measure things accurately, to see the real cost of a problem and the real cost of a solution, and compare them honestly. "I'd need to ride up there and see what we're dealing with," he said. "Yes." She looked at the creek again. "Soon." He rode up to the Whitmore Basin 4 days later with Dean and Trace. The trail was bad. 30 years of abandonment had let the vegetation grow in, and 2 of those years had brought rockfalls that blocked sections of the upper path. It took them most of the morning to get to the reservoir site, and when they got there, Cole sat on his horse for a long minute, just looking. The dam structure was stone and timber, built by someone who'd known what they were doing. 30 years had taken a toll. There were places where the timber had rotted and needed replacement, and the outlet channel was completely choked with debris. But the stone courses were largely intact, and the basin behind the dam still held its shape. The storm damage, which had apparently been the reason for the abandonment, turned out to be in the access trail rather than the structure itself. Someone had either exaggerated the damage or given up before assessing it properly. "It's fixable," Trace said. "It's a lot of work," Dean said. "It's fixable," Cole said. He rode home and told Eliza. She was at the workroom counter when he came in, and she looked up from a piece she was hemming, and he took off his hat and said, "The structure is mostly sound. The outlet channel needs clearing and some of the timber needs replacing, but the stone's good. I think we can get it working." She set down the hemming, something in her face that he'd come to think of as the held-back version of her expressions. The place where she kept the things she felt but didn't show, relaxed slightly. "Then we should start soon," she said. "We," he said. "If you want my help," she said simply, neither pressing nor pulling back. "I do," he said. "I want your help." There was a pause. In the workroom, the light from the window fell across the work table at its late afternoon angle, the one that turned the cut cloth golden. "Then yes," she said, "we start soon." He didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at her, the calm steadiness of her, the way she occupied her space without apology or performance. She was not what any version of his expectations would have produced. She was considerably more than he'd thought to ask for. "Eliza," he said. "Cole," she said back. And there was something in the way she said it, his name in her voice, no formality, that changed the air in the room slightly. He put his hat back on. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "We need to talk through the supply list." "I'll have coffee on," she said, and went back to her hemming. He walked out into the late afternoon of Red Hollow's main street, where the light was long and the shadows of the buildings stretched east across the packed dirt, and somewhere up in the Whitmore Basin, an old dam waited on the edge of something. He didn't know what all of it was going to cost yet. The work, the opposition, the weight of a town that had decided to have opinions about his choices. He knew what the creek's low water meant for the cattle and the finances, and he knew what fixing the reservoir might mean. And he knew that Eliza Hart had seen both those things clearly and without flinching. He walked back toward where he'd tied his horse, in the long light, and did not yet understand that the hardest part of all of it was still ahead. The supply list took 2 evenings to work through. Cole came back the next afternoon as he'd said he would, and Eliza had coffee on the small wood stove in the corner of the workroom, and they sat on opposite sides of her work table with a piece of brown paper between them and went through what the reservoir job would actually require. Timber for the outlet frame. She wrote that down in a neat hand, the pencil moving across the paper with the same economical precision she applied to everything. Hardware, bolts, iron strapping, lengths of chain for the sluice mechanism. Tools they didn't have and would need to borrow or buy. Food and equipment for however many days the work would take, because the basin was a full morning's ride from the ranch, and there was no practical way to go back and forth daily while doing heavy construction work. "How many men can you spare?" she asked. "Dean and Trace for certain. Gus and Harlow if I pull them off the fence repair, but that'll set the lower pasture work back." He looked at the list. "I'm also thinking about asking Grayson to contribute some labor. His stock pond is already dry. He's got more at stake in this than he knows yet." "Does Grayson like you?" "He tolerates me. We've been neighborly. Tolerates you and works alongside you in the wilderness for several days are different things," she said, not making a judgment, just noting the distinction. "I know." Cole wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. The coffee was strong, not the polite weak coffee that got served at social calls. It tasted like something made for actual use. But if I frame it right, it's not me asking a favor. It's me pointing out that his water problem and my water problem are the same problem. Bas isti spon. She nodded slowly. "And if the work succeeds, he'll have had a hand in it. That matters to men like Grayson. That's the idea." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the list. "The mercantile is going to be difficult," she said. "Callum will fill the order after what you said to him, but the lumber, that's Breck's yard, and Breck is Iris Caldwell's brother-in-law." Cole set down his coffee. He hadn't known that. He should have. It was the kind of family connection that mattered in a town this size. But he'd never had reason to track the Caldwell family tree closely. "He'll overcharge you," she said, "or lose the order, or fill it wrong." "You know this for certain?" "I know Iris Caldwell," she said, which was not quite an answer but contained one. "She doesn't do things halfway." He looked at her across the table. There was something in the way she said it, not afraid, not bitter, just factual, that told him she'd already been thinking about this, had already mapped out the territory of opposition they'd be walking into, and was telling him what she saw. "Then I go to Hendricks and Milford for the lumber," he said. "It's farther, but Breck doesn't touch it. That adds a day to the timeline. Better than trusting Breck's yard." She picked up the pencil and made a note beside the timberline. Cole watched her write. She had a small, specific handwriting that moved across the page without flourishes, every letter getting exactly as much space as it needed. He'd noticed this before, the way her working style had no waste in it. Everything she did was sized to the actual requirement. "There's something else," she said, not looking up from the paper. "What?" She finished the note and set the pencil down. Then she looked at him with the steady, straight look she used when she was saying something she'd thought through carefully. "Mrs. Marsh came into the front of the shop yesterday afternoon." Cole waited. "She didn't want anything sewn. She sat in the chair customers use, and she told me, very pleasantly, very carefully, that Red Hollow was a town with a particular way of doing things, and that she admired my industry, and that it would be a shame if a woman in business for herself were to find her reputation damaged through no fault of her own. The workroom was quiet. Outside, the street had its ordinary afternoon sounds, a wagon going past, voices somewhere down the block. She said that, Cole said. His voice came out flat. She said it pleasantly. Eliza's voice was level. She offered to speak well of my work to her circle if I were to. She didn't put it directly. She was too careful for that. If I were to keep my social ambitions proportionate to my situation. Cole put both hands flat on the work table. He did it quietly, not a slam, but Eliza looked at his hands. "What did you say?" he asked. I thanked her for coming in and told her I had work to finish. "Eliza, what did you want me to say?" She said it without heat, just a genuine question. That she should mind herself? She knows what she's doing. Getting angry at her in my own shop doesn't help me, and it gives her exactly what she came for, which is a reaction she can describe to her friends. She picked up the pencil again. The lumber. Hendricks and Milford. What else needs to go on this list? He looked at her for a moment. The anger in him was a specific kind, not hot and impulsive, but cold, the kind that settles in and doesn't leave quickly. He'd known that the social pressure would be real. He'd known the town would have opinions. He hadn't let himself think clearly enough about what that would mean for her specifically, the daily texture of it. A woman in business who depended on the goodwill of the community she sewed coats for, being visited by Vera Marsh in her own shop and told to stay in her place. "We'll need rope," he said. "Heavy rope, for pulling the debris out of the outlet channel." She wrote it down. He talked to Grayson the following week. Luther Grayson ran a mid-sized cattle operation on the south side of the valley. Not as large as Cole's, but a solid, well-managed piece of land that Grayson had inherited from his father and worked hard to keep solvent. He was a thick-shouldered man in his 50s, deliberate in movement and speech, the kind of man who gave the impression of having weighed most of his words before he used them. He and Cole had been neighborly in the way of men who share a fence line and a watershed, cooperative on the practical things, not particularly close. Cole found him at the stock pond he'd mentioned, standing on the cracked mud at the edge of what had been, 6 months ago, 3 feet of water. The pond was down to a muddy puddle in the center, barely enough for the dozen cattle standing around it looking uncertain. "Creek's the same," Cole said. Grayson looked at him sideways. "I know it. I've been up to the Whitmore Basin, Harker's Reservoir." A pause. "You went up there?" 3 weeks ago. The structure's sound. Better than anyone thought. The access trail needs work, but it's passable. If we clear the outlet channel and replace some of the rotted timber, it'll hold water and release it controlled through the rest of the summer." Cole paused. "It'll fix your pond, and it'll fix my creek." Grayson was quiet, looking at the muddy puddle that used to be his water supply. "How much work are we talking?" "A week in the basin, maybe 8 days. I need labor. I'll cover the materials. I've already sourced the lumber. I need men who know what they're doing and won't quit when it gets hard." Grayson looked at him for a long moment. "And you're asking me specifically. You're downstream. You've got more reason than most to want this fixed. And you need the extra hands. That too." Grayson chewed something. Probably nothing. It was just a thinking habit Cole had noticed in him before. Then, "My boy Emmett and my hand Cordero. I'll come up myself for the first 3 days." "That's enough." Grayson looked back at his stock pond. "This her idea? The seamstress?" Cole held Grayson's gaze. "She's the one who knew the reservoir was there. She's the one who looked at the creek and understood what the numbers meant." He paused. "It's a good idea. It doesn't matter whose it was." Grayson made a sound that was not agreement but wasn't argument either. "Week after next," he said. "I need to move my cattle to the Heller lease for water before I can spare men." "Week after next," Cole said. What? The thing Cole hadn't anticipated, or had half anticipated and pushed to the back of his mind, was that none of this happened quietly. Red Hollow was too small for anything to happen quietly. The lumber order going to Milford instead of Breck's yard was noticed and discussed. Cole's visits to Eliza's workroom were documented mentally by anyone with a window on the relevant block and reported through the network of social information that ran through the town like its own invisible creek. And when Cole went to the weekly gathering at the Harmon feed barn, the informal meeting of ranchers and farmers that happened every few weeks to talk about shared concerns, water rights, grazing boundaries, the kind of thing that didn't have an official structure but functioned as one. He walked into a room that had already been having a different conversation. He felt it when he came through the door. The quality of the silence that replaced the talk when he entered. Not the ordinary pause of acknowledgement, but a pause with something underneath it, a held breath. Dale Whitfield spoke first. He was a land speculator who'd bought up 2 failed homestead claims on the east end of the valley and was always present at these gatherings despite not being a working rancher, which Cole had always found mildly irritating. "Mercer," he said, with the careful warmth of a man who had something to say and was timing his approach. "Here you've been taking an interest in the old Harker works. Planning on clearing the reservoir," Cole said. He took a seat on the bench along the side wall, set his hat on his knee. Around the barn, the other men were watching in the peripheral way of people trying to look like they're not watching. "Creek's running low. Grayson's pond is dry. It makes sense. Takes quite a crew to work a job like that," Whitfield said. "I've got a crew. Hear you've also been spending time in town." Whitfield said it easily, conversationally. "At the seamstress's shop." The barn was quiet in a particular way. Cole looked at Whitfield. "I've had some coats repaired," he said. "Is there something specific you wanted to say, Dale?" Whitfield smiled, the careful smile of a man who'd been challenged before and knew how to handle it. No, just making conversation. Town notices things is all. Town can notice what it wants." Cole looked around the barn. Grayson, he noticed, was examining the ground near his boots with concentration. Heller looked uncomfortable. A few of the older ranchers had the neutral faces of men who'd seen this kind of thing before and had opinions they were keeping to themselves. "If anyone here has a practical concern about the reservoir project, I'd like to hear it. If it's social commentary, you can save it." Nobody spoke up with a practical concern. The meeting went on. They talked about the drought, about water rights, about the toll the dry summer was taking on everyone's cattle. Cole listened and contributed and did not look at Whitfield again. But on the walk to his horse afterward, he was aware of something settling in the air of the valley, a pressure that had been building slowly and was now approaching the kind of critical weight that changes things. Bassan. Eliza's trouble came in 3 shapes, in the week before the reservoir crew was scheduled to leave. The first shape was merchant. Burnham's fabric supplier in the next town over sent word, through the postal agent, which was a formal and deliberate choice, that they would be unable to extend her credit line for the coming season. No explanation. Her credit had been good for 2 years. She read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer under the counter. The second shape was social. She went to the general store for flour and lamp oil, and the woman behind the counter, a woman she'd exchanged ordinary pleasantries with for 2 years, suddenly had difficulty with her order, couldn't find several items that were plainly on the shelf, spoke to her with the particular distant politeness that isn't politeness at all. Eliza paid for what she could get, said thank you, and left. The third shape was direct. She was locking up the workroom for the night, the last of the summer light going orange over the roofline across the alley, when she heard footsteps and turned to find Iris Caldwell standing at the alley entrance. Iris was dressed well, as she always was. She understood that appearance was a form of argument. She had her hands folded in front of her, and the expression of a woman who has prepared what she intends to say. "Miss Hart," she said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "You're not disturbing me," Eliza said. She had her key in her hand, and she didn't put it away. "I'll be direct," Iris said. "I respect directness." She paused, organizing something. "There are people in this town who have invested a great deal over many years in building this community into something worthwhile. People whose families have been here since before the valley was settled. Cole Mercer is part of that community. His ranch, his reputation, his place in the order of things here. I think you understand what I'm saying." I think you're about to tell me I don't fit," Eliza said. Iris's expression didn't shift exactly, but something behind it did. She hadn't expected Eliza to say it that plainly. "I'm telling you that what might seem like a simple personal matter has consequences that extend further than you may appreciate. Consequences for business, for standing, for the kind of life a man in Cole's position can build here." Has Cole asked for your opinion on this? I'm offering it without being asked. That's sometimes the more honest kind. Eliza looked at her. Iris Caldwell was not a stupid woman. She was, in fact, precisely as sharp as Cole had implied, and she had the particular confidence of a person who had been the most competent person in most rooms she'd ever entered. Eliza recognized that kind of confidence. She'd spent years in proximity to people who wore it like armor. I appreciate your honesty, Eliza said, in a tone that was entirely neutral. Good evening, Mrs. Caldwell. Peace. She walked past her and out of the alley and didn't look back. She went home to her small rented room above the printer's shop, sat on the edge of the bed, and was still for a long time. She was not crying. She didn't cry easily, and she didn't cry now, though there was something tight in her chest that might have become tears in a different person in a different life. She was thinking. She understood what was happening. She had always understood, in some part of herself, that it would escalate to this, that the social machinery of Red Hollow would grind against her if she didn't remove herself from its gears. She'd built her life here carefully. The business, the small stock of trust she'd accumulated over 2 years of honest work, the thin stability of a life that was hers even if it was modest. She'd been aware, from the beginning, of how much of that depended on being acceptable to the people who decided what acceptable meant. What she hadn't built a defense against was wanting something that required her to stop being invisible. She thought about Cole sitting across her work table with a list between them, working through a problem with the same unsentimental focus he'd applied to everything she'd watched him apply it to. She thought about the way he'd said her name across the low-water creek, as if getting it right mattered. She thought about the hat, which she'd repaired without expectation and which had come back to her, come back in the form of a man who'd bothered to say thank you and then came back again and again, not asking for anything she hadn't offered and not performing anything she hadn't asked for. She thought, I am not going to make myself small enough for Iris Caldwell's preferences. I decided that before this started, and nothing she said in that alley changed it. She lay down on the bed, still in her work clothes, and stared at the ceiling. The crew was leaving for the Whitmore Basin in 6 days. There was still work to finish before she could leave the shop for the days the expedition would take. She would need to pack light, practical things, nothing extra. She had a pair of boots that were better for rough terrain than the ones she wore in the shop. She closed her eyes. Outside, Red Hollow settled into its nighttime sounds. The distant dogs, the creak of cooling wood, the wind moving through the gap between buildings with the dry summer sound of a place that needed rain. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. Cole came to the workroom 2 days later, and she told him about the credit letter and the fabric supplier and the general store, because she'd decided there was no point in protecting him from the shape of things. He needed to know what they were walking into, and she was tired of managing the information flow as if he were someone who couldn't handle it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she watched him hold the anger in the same controlled way she'd seen before, not suppressing it, just keeping it from running ahead of his thinking. You're still coming up to the basin, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes, she said. He nodded once. Then we go on schedule. He looked at her steadily. Whatever they're trying to do, they haven't done it yet. The lumber is in Milford. Grayson's confirmed his men. The trail's been marked. A pause. We do the work. Everything else gets dealt with after. She looked at him. He was not pretending it was simple. He was not reassuring her with promises he couldn't keep. He was just laying out what was true. The work could still be done, so they would do it. The outlet channel is going to be the worst of it, she said. 30 years of debris and vegetation. It'll take at least 2 days just to clear it. Dean's bringing the heavy tools. And the timber replacement. The inner frame sections especially, they'll need to be fitted precisely or the sluice won't hold pressure. Trace is good with fit work, better than me. And food. Did you sort out the food? Dean's wife is packing it. Cole picked up his hat from the corner of the table where he'd set it. You need anything before we leave? Anything from the shop sorted? I've asked Mrs. Fowler to take orders while I'm gone. She does mending. It's enough to keep the front door open. Good. He put on his hat. He was at the workroom door when he stopped and turned back. Eliza. What? What Iris Caldwell said to you in that alley. He held her gaze. I want you to know, she doesn't speak for me. She doesn't speak for anything I want. It wasn't a speech. It was a short, direct statement, the kind he made when he wanted to be sure something was understood. She looked at him across the cluttered, familiar space of her workroom, with its smell of cut cloth and beeswax and the low sound of the summer outside. I know, she said. He nodded and left. She stood for a moment in the silence he'd left behind, then turned back to the jacket she was finishing for Mrs. Fowler's neighbor, picked up her needle, and got back to work. They left before dawn on a Tuesday, 6 days after the schedule Cole had set, because the wagon carrying the Milford lumber broke an axle on the last stretch of road, and they'd lost 2 days getting it repaired and reloaded. It was a bad start, and everyone in the crew knew it, but nobody said much about it. They just loaded the rest of the gear in the dark and moved. There were 8 of them. Cole and Dean and Trace and the 2 brothers Gus and Harlow, plus Grayson's son Emmett, and his hand Cordero, and Eliza. The wagon carried tools and timber and enough food for 10 days, packed by Dean's wife in a way that left no cubic inch wasted. The riding was hard going from the first hour. The trail into the Whitmore Basin climbed steeply once it left the valley floor, and the loaded wagon slowed everything to a grinding pace that made Cole's jaw tight. Eliza rode near the back of the group for most of the first morning, not because anyone had placed her there, but because her horse was the smallest and the trail was narrow in sections where you wanted the bigger animals in front. She didn't complain about the pace, or the dust, or the fact that her saddle had a loose girth strap that Trace had to stop and tighten twice before she mentioned it a third time, and he looked at her and said, "You should have said something 4 miles back." And she said, "I know," without defensiveness. Dean rode alongside Cole for much of the morning. He didn't say much. He was a man who understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that didn't, and Cole's silence that morning was the second kind. Not troubled exactly, but focused, the particular concentration of a man working through variables in his head. What Cole was working through was this. They had 8 days before Grayson's men had to be back, and the job, realistically assessed, was 10 days of work with this crew size. He'd been telling himself the math was close enough. Up on the mountain, in the actual terrain, he wasn't so sure. They made camp at the basin approach as the light was going. Cordero and Emmett were efficient campmen. The fire going and the horses tended before the rest of them had finished unloading the wagon. Gus cooked, which surprised everyone who hadn't traveled with him before, because Gus was a man of very few apparent skills, but happened to make a genuinely good camp stew out of very limited materials. Harlow, his brother, had no comparable skill and seemed at peace with this fact. Eliza sat with Cole after dinner, away from the fire but in the radius of its light, with the survey sketch he'd made on his first trip spread on a flat rock between them. "Show me the channel," she said. He pointed to the outlet. "It runs along this eastern face, drops about 40 feet, and feeds into the main creek system at the lower basin. 30 years of debris. Trees came down, vegetation grew in, probably some rock displacement from the winters." He traced the line with his finger. "The channel itself is cut stone, original construction. If the stone is sound, we clear what's in it. If sections have collapsed, we're rebuilding them, and that's the part that costs us days." She studied the sketch. "And the dam face? Top section needs recalking between the stone courses. Some of the original mortar has washed out." He paused. "The sluice gate mechanism is the real question. I don't know what condition the iron's in until we open it up." "If the iron's seized, then Trace spends a day on it. He's worked with seized iron before." Cole looked at the sketch. "If it's cracked through, we're fabricating a replacement in the field, which is not something I want to be doing at altitude." She was quiet, following the lines of the sketch with her eyes. "The eastern channel first," she said. "Start clearing it tomorrow. Put the most men on it. If the stone is sound, you'll know by the end of the second day, and you can adjust the rest of the schedule around that." "That's what I was thinking." "Then you didn't need to show me the sketch." "I showed it to you because I wanted your read on it." She looked up from the sketch. In the firelight, her face was all shadow and warmth, the way firelight does to people's faces, and she had the look she got when she was deciding whether to say something. "The channel's the core of it," she said. "Everything else depends on water moving through that channel cleanly. Fix the channel, and the rest of the problems become smaller." "Yes," he said. "Then the channel gets everything we have first." Cole nodded and rolled up the sketch. Around them, the mountain was very dark and very quiet, in the way mountains are at night, the kind of silence that has weight to it. The fire crackled. Somewhere above them, a nightbird made one short sound and stopped. "You doing all right?" he asked. He said it without preamble, the way he asked things when he'd decided to ask them. She considered the question honestly. "I'm tired. The saddle was uncomfortable and my left knee has been aching since the 3rd mile." She paused. "But I'm all right." "The knee—" "Old thing," she said. "It acts up sometimes. Don't make a project of it." He didn't push it. He knew better than to push things she'd marked as not for pushing. He stood, stretched, put his hat on against the night chill that was rolling down off the high rock. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's the worst day of work." "You don't know that yet." "I know enough," he said. He was right. Tomorrow was the worst day of work. What? The Eastern Channel was worse than the sketch had suggested, which was always how these things went. When they reached it in the early morning and began pulling back the vegetation that had grown over its mouth, they found not just debris, but a partial collapse. A section of the stone-cut wall, about 12 feet long, had given way inward under the weight of winter ice over successive years, leaving a section that was essentially a pile of displaced stone rather than a channel. The water, if they opened the sluice gate now, would pour through that section and go nowhere useful. Cole stood at the collapsed section and said nothing for a moment. Dean stood beside him. Behind them, the rest of the crew was still clearing the upper mouth of the channel, making progress on the debris without yet knowing about the problem downstream. "How long?" Cole said. Dean crouched and started moving stones with his hands, testing weight and placement. He'd done this kind of dry-stacked stonework before. He had a feel for it. "The stone's all here," he said. "It's displaced, not broken. Most of it's right here in the pile." He stood. "2 men who know what they're doing, full day, maybe day and a half." "We don't have a day and a half of margin." "No," Dean said. Eliza had come down the channel line behind them. She looked at the collapsed section without speaking, reading the same problem Cole and Dean were reading. "The stones need to go back in reverse order from how they came out," she said, almost to herself. "It's like seam work. You can't force the last piece if the preceding pieces aren't set right." Dean glanced at her. "That's exactly right. I can work this section with you, she said to Dean. "I'm not as strong for the lifting, but I can read the fit. Tell me what you need held, and I'll hold it." Cole looked at both of them. The morning was already burning, and he could feel the day's hours moving. Gus and Harlow on upper channel clearing. Trace starts on the sluice mechanism. Emmett and Cordero with me on the dam face. You two on the stonework. Nobody argued. They went to it. It was Trace who found the other problem. He was at the sluice gate by mid-morning, working on the iron mechanism with the careful, systematic approach he had for things that required patience rather than force. The gate itself was intact. The iron had surface rust, but nothing structural, and an hour with the tools he'd brought had gotten it moving. He was examining the connection between the gate mechanism and the gate frame, checking the seal points, when he noticed the pipe, the outlet pipe. The large iron pipe that carried water from behind the gate through the base of the dam had been cracked. Not recently. The crack was old, the oxidization around it thick with years, which meant it had been cracked when the dam was abandoned and no one had noticed because no one had looked. Water released through the gate would move correctly for about 4 feet and then distribute itself through the crack, under the dam base, going nowhere. Trace sat on his heels for a moment, looking at the crack. He was 22 years old and had worked for Cole for less than a year, and he had the professional instinct of someone who's learned that delivering bad news clearly and fast is better than the alternative. He stood up and went to find Cole. Cole was halfway up the dam face, recaulking a section of the stone courses, when Trace came up beside him. "Got a problem," Trace said, and explained it in the same plain terms he'd used to himself. Cole came down off the dam face. He looked at the pipe. He looked at the crack, ran his thumb along it, felt the depth of it with the tip of his finger. It was a clean crack, structural. The iron had failed under contraction stress, probably a very cold winter sometime in the past 30 years. The section would need to be cut out and replaced. The replacement pipe section was not on their supply list, because no one had known it was needed. Cole straightened up and looked out across the basin for a moment. The water they were trying to liberate was there, held above them in the snowmelt-fed lake that the dam contained, and between it and the valley below was this, a 12-foot channel wall in collapse, a cracked pipe, a sluice gate that worked fine and had nothing useful to connect to. "What do we have?" he said. Trace thought about it. "There's a section of the supply pipe we brought for the outlet extension. It's a different diameter." "How different?" "Couple inches. I could sleeve it if I had a collar fitting." "We don't have a collar fitting." "No." Trace paused. "But Cordero was a pipe fitter before he came to work for Grayson. I've heard him mention it." Cole turned and went to find Cordero. Cordero was a quiet man who did his work without commentary and had spoken perhaps 30 words total since leaving the valley. He listened to Cole describe the problem, walked to the pipe without hurry, crouched and looked at it for a long time, and then stood. "I can make a sleeve collar with what we have in the metal supplies," he said. "Sheet iron, the right bends. It won't be permanent, but it'll hold pressure through a season." "How long to make it?" 3 hours if I'm not interrupted." "Make it," Cole said. "You're not interrupted." Cordero went to the supply wagon and didn't say anything else about it. That night, around this fire, nobody talked about the schedule. They were all doing the arithmetic in their own heads and arriving at the same uncomfortable number, 2 days behind, with the channel rebuild still not finished, and the pipe sleeves still being fabricated and the dam face caulking only half done. They ate and were quiet and went to sleep as soon as the fire burned down enough to be safe to leave. Eliza's knee had gotten worse through the day. She hadn't said so again after the morning conversation, but Cole noticed how she moved getting up from the stonework, the careful way she shifted her weight, the slight delay before she could walk normally. He didn't mention it. She'd told him not to make a project of it, and she'd worked the full day without stopping. He made note of it the way he made note of everything, quietly, without immediate action, filed away. The second day they found a rhythm. The crew worked in silence for the most part, not the tense silence of conflict, but the working silence of people who have enough to do and understand the cost of distraction. Dean and Eliza finished the channel wall reconstruction by mid-afternoon. It was not elegant work. The replaced section was visibly different from the original, slightly lower at one end. But when Dean ran water from the upper channel through the cleaned section, it moved cleanly through without spreading or pooling. Eliza sat down on a rock and said, "Good," and didn't get up for 10 minutes. Cordero had the pipe sleeve finished by early afternoon and the installation done by late afternoon. Cole helped him fit it. The work required 2 sets of hands, one holding tension on the sleeve while the other drove the bolts. And when they were done, Cordero inspected the connection with the focused expression of a craftsman who was deciding whether to be satisfied. He ran his thumb along the joint. "It'll hold," he said, which from Cordero was practically a speech. On the third day, they opened the sluice gate. It was a small group standing at the dam when Cole and Trace worked the mechanism. The iron moved stiffly, but it moved, 1 turn, 2 turns, the resistance of years giving way to current force. And then there was a sound, deep and low and building, of water beginning to move through the system. The sound traveled. They heard it in the upper pipe before they saw it at the outlet, a rumble that moved through the stone of the dam itself, through the soles of their boots, as the held water found the channel that had been opened to receive it. Then it came through the outlet, not clean at first, carrying mud and decades of sediment, brown and thick and tumbling through the rebuilt stone channel section with a force that made the loose gravel on the banks vibrate. Nobody cheered. There was a collective exhale, something between relief and exhaustion, and Grayson's son Emmett said, "There it is," in a low voice, and Dean put his hand on Cole's shoulder briefly and then removed it. Cole was looking at the water. It was moving. It was going down the mountain, toward the lower basin, toward the creek system, toward the valley. The color of it was already lightening as the initial sediment cleared. It would be brown for a day or two, and then it would run clear. It would reach the creek. It would reach Grayson's stock pond. He turned to look at Eliza. She was standing a few feet to his left, watching the water in the channel with her arms crossed against the mountain cold. Her hair had come mostly loose from its pinning over 3 days of hard work and was hanging around her face in a way she hadn't bothered to fix. She had stone dust on her coat and a cut on her right hand from the channel reconstruction that she'd wrapped with a strip of cloth. She looked like what she was, which was a person who had spent 3 days working on a mountain. She turned and found him looking at her. They looked at each other across the sound of running water, and neither of them said anything, and it was enough. They came down from the mountain on the afternoon of the 7th day, ahead of Grayson's deadline, and 1 day ahead of their own outer estimate, which Cole took as something close to a victory. The last 2 days in the basin had been hard in the way hard physical work at altitude is hard, the kind that gets into your hands and your back and your lungs and stays there. Harlow had sprained 2 fingers on a rock on the 5th day and worked the remaining 2 days with them wrapped tight, complaining steadily and working without stopping, which was more or less his natural mode. Gus had run low on cooking materials on the 6th day and improvised something from dried beans and a smoked bone that was, by Dean's assessment, not as good as the first night's stew, but better than nothing. Eliza's knee had loosened up by the 4th day, which she mentioned to Cole only because he'd asked again, and she'd decided the danger of him making a project of it had passed. They came into the valley on the wagon road in the long afternoon light, and the first sign that things had changed was Grayson's reaction. They passed his south pasture on the route down, and Grayson was standing at the fence line with his hands on the top rail, looking at something in the distance. Cole pulled his horse up alongside. "Stock Pond," Grayson said without turning. Cole looked. 100 yards away, the stock pond that had been a muddy puddle 6 days ago was holding water. Not full, not yet, but visibly changed, the brown ring of exposed mud around its edge clearly narrowed. "Creek's running," Grayson said. "Been running since yesterday morning. My cattle have had water for 30 hours. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Thank you." He said it looking at his stock pond, not at Cole, and Cole understood that this was how Grayson said the things he really meant. "Thank Eliza," Cole said. "She knew the reservoir was there when nobody else remembered it existed." Grayson looked back along the group until he found her, a few horses back, and he gave her a long, direct nod. It was not an elaborate acknowledgement, but it was the kind that counts. The news about the sabotage arrived before they did. Cole found out through Dean, who'd ridden ahead to the ranch and came back up the road to meet them, with the particular expression of a man who had something to say that he'd rather not be saying. The creek head works on the northwest boundary of Cole's land. The small diversion structure that directed creek water into his upper pasture system had been damaged, not by the drought and not by weather, by design. Someone had pulled the main diversion logs and scattered them, then driven iron spikes into the structure's supports, and broken the guide board that directed water into the pasture channel. The kind of damage that takes maybe 2 hours to do, and that someone who knew irrigation works would recognize immediately as deliberate. Cole listened to Dean's account. His face did not change in any way that Dean could have described afterward. He sat on his horse with his hands loose on the reins and listened. "When?" he said. "Sometime in the last 2 days. Jake Whitmore's boy saw a rider in that area yesterday morning, but didn't know who." "One rider?" "Maybe 2. The ground was cut up enough that it was hard to read." Cole looked at the road ahead. Then he looked at Eliza, who had been close enough to hear Dean's account, and was watching Cole with the still expression she used when she was reading a situation. He thought, "She has taken hits from every direction for weeks, and she is still here, and she is watching me to see what I do next." "My cattle," he said to Dean, "moved them to the lower pasture this morning when I found it. They've got water for 2 more days on the stock tank before it runs low." "Buopers itu weekend. 2 days. Maybe 3 if we're careful." Cole nodded. He did the math. The reservoir water was moving into the creek system. It would take time to reach the northwest boundary. The system was long and the flow was still building. 2 days, maybe 3, before the restored water volume would be enough to reroute through a repaired diversion structure. He needed the cattle to have water for that window. "Heller," he said. "What about him? His creek runs from the same system. If the reservoir is flowing, his water's coming back too. He's got a stock tank that's been sitting empty for a month. It'll still be empty today, but it'll fill in the next 2 days. I need to use his pasture as a temporary hold while I repair the diversion works." "You want me to ride to Heller?" "I want to ride to Heller," Cole said. "I want to look him in the eye when I ask." He turned to the group. "Dean takes everyone else back to the ranch. Get the gear unloaded and the horses taken care of." He paused. "Eliza." She was already looking at him. "You can go back with Dean." He said it simply, not dismissively. She'd worked for 7 days and her knee was bad, and she'd earned the right to be done for the day. She considered him for a moment. Is Heller going to be easy to persuade? Not particularly. Then I'll come, she said. 2 people asking is more weight than 1. He thought about telling her she didn't need to. He didn't, because it was her choice, and because she was right that it was more weight, and because somewhere in the last 7 days on that mountain, the dynamic between them had shifted to something that he didn't have precise words for, but that felt like 2 people who had decided, without discussing it, to be in each other's corner. All right, he said. They turned their horses and rode toward Heller's land. Behind them, Dean watched them go, and then looked at Gus and Harlow and Trace and Emmett and Cordero, all of them trail-worn and tired and watching the same thing. Right, Dean said. Let's get the horses seen to. Tuck. Heller's place was 4 miles east of Cole's northwest boundary, a modest spread that had been in the Heller family since the valley was first settled, and that showed its age in the good way. The fences were old but tight. The barn had been patched so many times it was practically a different barn from the original, and the house sat low against the hillside like something that had decided it was staying. Roy Heller was 63 years old and had opinions about most things, and kept them to himself unless asked, which Cole had always respected. They found him in the barn. He came out when he heard the horses, squinting against the late afternoon light, and looked at Cole and Eliza with the neutral assessment of a man who'd learned not to read anything into the arrival of unexpected company until he knew what they wanted. You look like you've been living rough, he said to Cole. 7 days in the Whitmore Basin, Cole said. We got the reservoir running. Heller's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. That's what they were saying in town. Figured it was a rumor. It's not a rumor. The creek is running. Your pasture water should be building back within 2 days, maybe 3. Cole got off his horse. I need to ask you something. Heller looked at Eliza, then back at Cole. Come inside, he said. They sat at Heller's kitchen table with 3 cups of coffee that Heller made without asking if they wanted any, which Cole took as a good sign. The kitchen was clean in the particular way of a man who lived alone and had developed systems. Everything in a specific place. Nothing decorative, nothing extra. Cole laid it out plainly. The sabotage at the diversion works. The cattle that needed water for the 2 to 3 day window before the reservoir flow reached his system. The request to use Heller's east pasture and its stock tank as a temporary hold. Heller listened without interrupting. When Cole finished, Heller wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and was quiet for a moment. Who did the diversion works, he said. It wasn't really a question. I don't know yet. You have a guess. I have a guess, Cole said. Heller looked at Eliza. You were up there on the mountain with this crew. I was, she said. You know anything about reservoir construction? I knew enough to read the problem and help with the channel rebuild, she said. The rest was Cole and Dean and Cordero. Heller made the sound of a man processing information. He looked at his coffee. My east pasture's yours for the week. Stock tank's sitting empty, but it'll fill before your cattle get thirsty again if the creek's truly running. He paused. You'll want to move them tonight. Tonight, Cole agreed. I'll help you move them. I've got nothing pressing. He said it the way practical people offer help, without fanfare, just as a logistical fact. Cole felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since Dean's account on the road. Thank you, Roy. Don't thank me. Thank the water. Heller stood and took his hat off the hook by the door. Drink up. We've got cattle to move. They moved the herd by lamplight, Cole and Heller and 2 of Heller's ranch hands pushing 90 head along the fence-line trail between the 2 properties in the darkness with the particular controlled noise of a night cattle drive. Low voices, the creak of saddle leather, the sound of hooves on dry ground. It took 3 hours and went without major incident, which Cole had not expected. He'd expected at least one breakaway, at least one section of the herd that decided the dark was a reason to panic. Instead, they moved like animals that had decided cooperating was in their interest, which sometimes happened and you couldn't predict it. Eliza rode drag, the back position, the one that ate the most dust and required the most sustained attention because it was where the stragglers ended up. She did it without being asked and without commenting on it. When the last of the herd was through the east pasture gate and Heller's hand had it closed and latched, she let her horse slow to a walk and just breathed for a moment. Cole came back along the line and fell in beside her. You didn't have to ride drag, he said. Someone had to. Gus could have. Gus wasn't here, she said. She was right. The move had been Cole and Heller and the two ranch hands and Eliza, because Dean and the rest of the crew were back at the ranch. She looked at the closed gate, at the dark shapes of the cattle finding their way to the water tank by instinct. They'll be all right in there. 2 days, Cole said. 3 at most. She nodded. She was tired in a way that had gone past the ordinary kind, the deep tiredness of a person who had given a sustained effort over many days and was now running on the far side of their reserves. He could see it in how she held herself on the horse, the slight forward lean. Come back to the ranch, he said. You've been sleeping in a tent on a mountain for a week. Dean's wife put a room together. She looked at him sideways. People will talk. People have been talking since October, he said. I don't see that slowing down either way. She was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. Chug. The ranch at night was quiet in the way it only got when all the hands were in and the stock was settled. Dean's wife, a spare and efficient woman named Clara, who had opinions about hospitality that she expressed through action rather than speech, had left a plate of food and a lamp burning in the small side room that was normally used for storage and had been hurriedly converted into a guest room with a cot and a folded blanket. Eliza looked at it and said, "Thank you," in a voice that sounded like she meant it the way you mean something when you've been carrying a weight for a while and someone just takes a small piece of it without being asked. Cole sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and the survey map of his northwest boundary, working out in his head what the diversion repair would require. It was late and he was tired and the math was not complicated, but he did it carefully because in his experience, the errors you made when tired were the ones that cost you time later. He heard the door to the side room open and Eliza came out, still in her working clothes, and sat down across the table without asking if he wanted company. The diversion repair, she said. Half a day's work. The damage was deliberate, but it wasn't technical. Pulling out logs and driving in spikes is destruction, not precision. Putting it back together is straightforward. He looked at the map. I want to do it myself, not send the hands. Why? Because I want to look at the ground around it and read who was there. He paused. And because I want to be the one who repairs it. Not for any good reason, just because. She understood that. She didn't say so, but he could tell. The Jake Whitmore boy who saw the rider, she said. How old is he? 14? 15? Could he describe what he saw in more detail? The horse? The rider's build? Cole looked up from the map. You think he knows more than Dean reported? I think a 15-year-old boy who witnesses something out of the ordinary remembers more than he tells the first adult who asks him, because he doesn't know what's important. She paused. If you talked to him directly, without his father in the room, you'd probably get a better account. Cole looked at her for a moment. It was a simple and obviously correct observation, the kind that seems obvious after someone says it, and that he wouldn't have gotten to on his own for another day or two because he was thinking about the physical repair rather than the information problem. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. She went back to bed. He stayed up another 20 minutes with the map and then folded it and went to sleep. He talked to the Whitmore boy the next afternoon. His name was Cal, and he was 16, not 15, and he'd been running a fence check on the northeast side of his father's property when he'd seen the rider. Cole found him alone by the stock pen behind the Whitmore barn and asked him directly, without preamble, what he'd actually seen. Cal was the kind of boy who stood up straighter when an adult talked to him like he was capable of an accurate account. He thought for a moment, clearly, and then said, 2 riders, not 1. I told Mr. Dean one because I wasn't sure about the second. He was further back in the tree line. But he was there. The first rider, describe him. Big man. Wide in the shoulders. Gray horse, older, had a white patch on the near shoulder. Cal paused. He was wearing a long coat. Brown or dark green, hard to say in that light, and he had a hat with a flat brim. Not the regular kind, the kind that's stiffened all the way around. Cole kept his face neutral. And the second? Smaller, couldn't make out much. He stayed in the trees. How long were they at the diversion works? Maybe 2 hours. I didn't stay. I had the rest of the fence to check, and I didn't think much of it at the time. Thought maybe they were checking the water level. He looked at Cole. Was it bad, what they did? It was deliberate, Cole said. That's what matters. He thanked the boy and rode back to the ranch. The gray horse with the white shoulder patch belonged to Warren Selby. Cole knew this the way you know things in a small community, not because he'd cataloged it, but because Warren Selby had ridden that horse to the ranchers' gathering 3 months ago, and someone had commented on its unusual marking. Selby was a land agent who handled transactions for several of the valley's larger property holders. He'd worked for Dale Whitfield. He'd also, Cole was fairly certain, worked for Iris Caldwell, handling a property lease on her behalf the previous year. He sat with this information for an evening before deciding what to do with it. The problem was that a 16-year-old boy's description of a man on a gray horse was not the same as evidence. It placed Selby in proximity. It did not, in any way that a reasonable person couldn't argue around, prove that Selby had done the damage. And if Cole went directly at Selby or Whitfield or the Caldwells with an accusation he couldn't fully support, he would look like a man making excuses, using a vandalism incident as cover for a personal feud. He needed something more solid. He talked to Dean first, then to Grayson, who he rode out to sea on the pretext of checking the stock pond level. The pond was visibly fuller. The reservoir water was doing its work, moving through the system, reaching the lower valley. Grayson was standing at the same fence rail where he'd stood before, but his posture was different. A man whose cattle have water stands differently than a man whose cattle don't. "I need to ask you something," Cole said, "about the land agent Selby." Grayson looked at him. "What about him? Has he approached you about your property in the last year? Any conversations about land value, potential transactions, anything like that?" Grayson was quiet for a moment in a way that told Cole the answer was yes before he said it. "Last spring," Grayson said. "He came by saying he had a client interested in valley land. Didn't name the client, said the offer would be favorable." "What did you say?" "Said I wasn't selling." Grayson paused. "He came back in August. Same conversation." "He came back after the drought started getting serious," Cole said. Grayson looked at the stock pond. "Yes," he said slowly. "He did." "Did he approach anyone else you know of?" "Heller. I know that because Heller mentioned it. Said a land agent was sniffing around and he'd told him to get off his property." Grayson turned to look at Cole directly. "You think someone was trying to drive people off their land? I think someone saw the drought and saw an opportunity. And I think when the reservoir changed the math, they tried to recover the advantage." Cole paused. "The damage to my diversion works happened while we were on the mountain, when no one would be watching. Why must—" Grayson was quiet for a long time. The stock pond sat in the afternoon light, fuller than it had been in months. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Come to the ranchers' meeting next week. Bring Heller if you can get him. And if Selby has made any written approaches to your property, letters, any documentation, bring those too." The ranchers' meeting was held at the Harmon Feed Barn on a Thursday evening, and it was better attended than any Cole could remember. Word had gotten around about the reservoir, about the drought response, about the damage diversion works. And the valley had the heightened attention of a community that senses something has shifted and isn't sure yet how to read the new configuration. Cole stood up in the middle of it after the ordinary business had been dispensed with and laid everything out. He started with the reservoir. He described the work in plain terms. The condition they'd found it in, the repairs made, what it would mean for the valley's water supply going forward, not just this season but in future dry years. He gave credit specifically. Dean's stonework, Trace's mechanical work, Cordero's pipe sleeve, Grayson's men. And Eliza, who was sitting on a bench along the side wall, watching him, who had known the reservoir was there when nobody else remembered it. There was a particular quality to the room's silence when he said her name. Then he described the sabotage. He did it carefully, without accusation by name. He presented the facts as facts. The deliberate damage to the diversion works, the timing during their absence, Cal Whitmore's account of 2 riders, the description of the gray horse. He then described Selby's approach to Grayson and to Heller. Grayson, who was sitting 3 rows back, confirmed it in the direct one-sentence way he confirmed things. Heller, beside him, nodded. He did not say Iris Caldwell's name. He did not say Dale Whitfield's name. He said that the drought had created an opportunity for land consolidation by those with sufficient capital, and that the valley's working ranchers needed to understand what had been happening around them. The room was very quiet. Dale Whitfield was there. Cole had seen him when he came in, had noted his position near the door the way you note exit routes. Whitfield's face, through this account, went through several stages of expression that ended somewhere carefully neutral. He did not speak up. Iris Caldwell was not present, but her brother-in-law Breck was, and he sat through the meeting with the particular stillness of someone hoping not to be noticed. When Cole was done, the questions came. They were good questions, practical questions, about the reservoir's capacity, about maintenance, about what a collective water agreement among the Valley ranchers would look like. Roy Heller, who had been quiet through the whole proceeding, stood up at one point and said, in his 63-year-old voice that had the weight of somebody who'd been in that valley since before most of the people in the room, I've been approached twice by a land agent working for people in this room. I said no both times. I want everybody here to know that. The room absorbed this. Several heads turned toward Whitfield, who sat with his careful, neutral expression. Then something unexpected happened. A man named Prentice, who ran a small farming operation on the south end of the valley and had never been particularly aligned with anyone, stood up and said he'd also been approached. Then a woman named Mrs. Garwood, who'd been running her late husband's property alone for 3 years, said the same. Then a younger rancher named Bodine, who Cole barely knew, said it had happened to him twice and he'd thought it was just ordinary business until right now. The room did the math together. Cole watched it happen. The moment when a collection of private grievances becomes a shared understanding. It was not a dramatic moment. It didn't involve speeches or confrontations. It was just people in a barn realizing simultaneously that what they'd each experienced privately was part of a pattern, and that patterns have architects. After the meeting, Cole found Eliza near the door. She was watching Whitfield make his way out, his exit hasty in the way of a man who's calculated his exposure and decided speed is the better option. "You didn't say his name," she said to Cole. "I didn't have to." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." She was looking at the room, at the people standing in small groups, talking with the focused energy of people who have just reorganized how they think about something. Grayson was talking to Heller. Mrs. Garwood was talking to Prentice. The conversations were practical. Who knew a land attorney? What documentation existed? What the proper course of action looked like? It was the sound of people who'd stopped being isolated and started being a community again. "How's your knee?" Cole said. She looked at him. "Better." "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to actually answer it and not give me the version you think I want." She waited. "Are you all right?" "All of it. The shop, the pressure, all the weeks of it." She was quiet for a moment. Around them the barn was thinning out, people filtering into the evening. She looked at the floor, then at him. "I've been better," she said, "and I've been a lot worse. Right now I'm tired and my knee aches and the credit situation with the fabric supplier isn't resolved." She paused. "But I'm here, and that shop is mine, and nobody drove me out of it." He looked at her. She looked back, steady, the way she'd looked at him from the first, like a person who saw another person, not a reputation, not a category, not a solution to a problem. "The diversion works are repaired," he said. "Creek's running full. Cattle are back on the home pasture." He paused. "Come see it tomorrow. I want to show you." She considered him with a slight expression that was close to a smile. "What time?" "Early, before the heat." "Then I'll be there," she said. They walked out of the Harmon barn into the evening air of Red Hollow, and behind them the last of the meeting sounds faded into ordinary night noise, and the creek ran the way it was supposed to run, the way it would run now through the dry months ahead, because of the work done by the people who'd done it. The town had not finished deciding what it thought about all of this. There would be more conversations, and some of them would be difficult, and the question of Warren Selby and the people who directed him would move through the slow machinery of the community's justice the way these things always moved. Not quickly, not cleanly, but with the particular grinding persistence of a truth that too many people now shared to disappear. But that was tomorrow's work, and the day after's. Tonight the water was running and the cattle were home, and Cole Mercer and Eliza Hart walked out of the barn into the late summer dark, not touching, just walking side by side, in the particular way of two people who have been through something together and come out the other side and don't need to make a speech about it. She came early, as she'd said she would. The light was still low when Eliza rode up the main track to the Mercer Ranch, the kind of pale morning light that makes everything look like it hasn't fully decided what it is yet. Cole was at the fence line near the lower pasture when he heard her horse, and he waited where he was rather than going to meet her, because the thing he wanted her to see was right there, and the walk from the gate would bring her to it naturally. She tied her horse and came along the fence, and then she stopped. The creek was running, not the thin, uncertain trickle of the drought months, running genuinely, with the sound and movement of water that had somewhere to go and enough of itself to get there. It came down through the rocky cut above the pasture and spread into the diversion channel that Cole had rebuilt 3 days ago. And from there, it moved through the pasture system the way it was supposed to. The way it had for the first years of the ranch before the drought had slowly reduced it to nothing. The cattle were grazing along the lower pasture fence with the contented, incurious look of animals whose basic requirements are being met. They did not seem to appreciate the significance of the water. They were cows. But Cole watched Eliza watch them, and he saw in her face something that was not triumph exactly, more like the particular satisfaction of a person who has looked at a problem clearly, worked on it honestly, and is now looking at the result with the sober recognition that it is real. "It's good water," she said. "It'll be good through the fall now, maybe beyond if the winters are decent." He came and stood beside her at the fence. Grayson's pond is full. Heller's pasture system is running. Bodine and Prentice both confirmed their creek levels are up. He paused. "The whole valley floor is different than it was 2 weeks ago." She nodded, looking at the water. "It doesn't fix everything." "No," he said. "It fixes the water." That was the honest version, and they both knew it. The water was fixed. The rest? The damage to people's credit, the frayed community relationships, the outstanding question of Warren Selby and the people who'd been behind him. That was still moving through its own slow process. Water you could fix in 8 days with enough labor and the right knowledge. Trust took longer. Accountability took longer still. And the particular kind of damage that comes from being told, repeatedly and from multiple directions, that you don't belong, that left marks that running water couldn't wash out. Cole had been thinking about this. He'd been thinking about it since the barn meeting, since watching Eliza stand at the barn door and look at the room and say, "Nobody drove me out of it," with the quiet, certain tone of someone who had decided that a long time ago and was simply confirming it was still true. He'd been thinking about the months behind them, the weight she'd carried without complaint, the specific ways the town had tried to make her position untenable, and the fact that she'd continued to work and plan and show up, not because she hadn't felt it, but because she'd decided not to let it be the determining thing. He had a tendency, he knew, to respect this kind of endurance from a distance, to observe it and admire it and say nothing about it, because saying something felt like it might break the thing he was observing. It was a habit he'd developed around his own difficulties over the years. You got through it. You didn't make a ceremony of the getting through. But he was standing next to a woman who had gotten through considerably more than a bad season, and he thought the distance he kept out of habit might be something he needed to close. "I want to say something," he said. She looked at him sideways. "All right. I know what this year has cost you. Not the reservoir works. I mean the other part. The shop, the suppliers, Vera Marsh in your workroom, Iris Caldwell in your alley." He looked at the creek. "I've thought about whether I handled it right. Whether there was a way I could have taken more of the weight of it." She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't put it on me," she said. "I know. But I also didn't. I kept things at a distance sometimes when I shouldn't have." He paused, working out how to say it. He was not a man who found this kind of conversation easy. He'd built his whole working life around the comfort of problems that could be measured and assessed and solved with appropriate tools, and this was not that kind of problem. "I think I got so used to keeping my life uncomplicated that I didn't move fast enough when things started getting hard for you." Eliza turned to look at him fully. He met her eyes. She had the expression she used when she was reading something carefully. Not judging, just reading. "Cole," she said, "you talked to Callum at the Mercantile. You sourced the lumber in Milford when Breck's yard would have been easier. You came back to tell me the reservoir was repairable before you told anyone else." She paused. "You moved your cattle in the dark and got up at dawn to fix your own diversion works, and then rode to Heller to ask for help rather than demanding it. A slight pause. You did plenty. It wasn't enough. Maybe not, she said, without softening it falsely. But it was honest, and that mattered more than you think. She looked back at the creek. I've had people do everything for me who didn't actually see me. I'd rather have someone who sees me and does imperfectly than someone who performs perfectly and sees nothing. He stood with that for a moment. The creek moved past them with its good sound. Warren Selby left Red Hollow inside of 2 weeks. It wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no formal accusation, no scene in the street. What happened was quieter and more thorough than a scene. Grayson and Heller and Mrs. Garwood and Prentice between them had documentation. Written correspondence from Selby presenting offers on behalf of unnamed clients, dated communications that showed the pattern of approach accelerating after the drought began. They took it to the county land registry office, where a clerk named Adkins, who had been in his position for 15 years and had seen this kind of thing before, read it with a long face and said he'd be referring it to the territorial land commissioner. Selby heard about this through the small-town channel by which everyone heard about everything, and he packed his office on the main street and left within 4 days of the referral. He left without saying goodbye to anyone, which surprised no one. Dale Whitfield stayed because Whitfield had been more careful about his exposure and the documentation didn't directly name him. But the ranchers' meeting had named him implicitly in ways that the community's memory would hold, and the particular influence he'd wielded at those gatherings. The easy social authority of a man who positioned himself as a neutral broker of information was simply gone. He still came to meetings. He sat in the back. Nobody sought his opinion. Iris Caldwell was a more complicated case. She was a competent businesswoman who had done genuinely useful things for the town over the years, and her connection to Selby's activities was plausible, but not demonstrated clearly enough to constitute an accusation anyone would make formally. What happened to her was what happens in small communities when the social winds shift. Not punishment exactly, but a reclassification. She went from being one of the Valley's defining social voices to being one of its successful business owners, which was still something, but was not the same thing. She understood this shift with the intelligence that had always characterized her and adapted to it with the efficiency she applied to everything. She did not, as far as Cole ever knew, acknowledge it directly to anyone. What she did do, about a month after the barn meeting, was send Eliza a letter requesting a coat commission. A good one, for winter, with specific details about cut and cloth. It was an odd letter, formal in the way of someone who was making a gesture they knew would be read as a gesture while maintaining plausible practicality. Eliza read it twice, then wrote back with the cost and timeline and a question about button preference. Cole found out about this when he noticed the coat on the form in Eliza's workroom one afternoon and asked whose it was. Mrs. Caldwell's, Eliza said without inflection. He looked at the coat, then at her. And you're making it. She paid half in advance. The work is the work. She was pinning the sleeve seam and didn't look up. I'm not going to refuse business from someone because she once stood in my alley and told me to know my place. If I did that, I'd refuse half the valley. A pause. The coat is due in 3 weeks. Then we're even. Cole considered this. It was not the response he'd have had. He was aware that his instinct was to hold grudges in the cold, contained way that didn't express itself as anger, but as a permanent reclassification. This person is no longer someone I extend good faith to. Full stop. Eliza's approach was different. Finish the transaction cleanly, collect what's owed, close the account without making theater of it. He couldn't decide if it was more practical or more forgiving, and then he decided it was probably both, which was her particular combination. You're a more reasonable person than I am, he said. In some ways, she said, and the slight expression that was close to a smile crossed her face. In other ways, you're considerably more reasonable than me. What ways are those? You talked to Grayson about the reservoir when I would have tried to solve the whole problem without asking anyone for help. He thought about that. That's not reasonable. That's just knowing when you need labor. Most people don't know that about themselves, she said. The fabric supplier's credit was restored in the fall, after Eliza paid down the outstanding balance and reestablished the account on a clear basis. It took 3 months of careful management and one firmly worded letter that Cole helped her draft, not because she needed help with the words, but because 2 signatures on a letter about commercial credit carry more weight than one, and she'd allowed him to help. The supplier had apparently received some version of the Selby situation's fallout through his own network and came back with a slightly apologetic tone that neither of them acknowledged directly. The shop recovered. It recovered the way practical things recover. Not in a single dramatic reversal, but in the slow accumulation of orders from people who'd been on the fence and had now gotten off it. Some of these people had been made guilty by what came out at the ranchers' meeting. Some of them had simply recalculated whose side it was prudent to be on. A few of them, Eliza thought it was a few, though she couldn't prove it, came in because they genuinely reconsidered. She didn't ask which was which. She made their coats. What changed more substantially was the social geography of the town around her. She was not suddenly popular in the way that dramatic reversals produce in stories. She was not embraced and celebrated and lifted up by the community that had tried to push her down. Life didn't work like that, and she'd been around long enough to know it. What changed was that the hostility that had been organized around her became disorganized. Without Iris Caldwell's social architecture actively directing it, without the weight of the Caldwell-Marsh alliance pressing against her, the ordinary indifference of people going about their business reasserted itself, which was not warmth, but was workable. She was good at working with workable. Mrs. Garwood started coming into the shop regularly, initially for practical alterations and then for longer visits that became, without either of them formally deciding this, something like a friendship. Garwood was a sharp, sardonic woman who had strong opinions about most things and shared them freely, and Eliza found her company useful in the way you find the company of someone with a very different background. Useful. They had both been women trying to hold on to something on difficult terms, and that was enough common ground to build on. Roy Heller sent his ranch hands to her for winter coat repairs, all 4 of them, which was a practical endorsement that she understood and appreciated. Grayson, who was not a social man, said nothing to her directly, but he told Luther, one of the men in his crew, to use Eliza's shop for all his tailoring needs, and Luther told another man, and within a season the south end of the valley's working men were sending her work in a steady trickle. It was Grayson's version of an apology for every time he'd looked at the ground when someone took a shot at her, and it was the version she could respect. But this mumbo... Cole asked her to marry him on a Tuesday in November, which was characteristic of him in the way that mattered. He didn't wait for a significant occasion, didn't manufacture a ceremony around it, just came into the workroom on an ordinary workday afternoon with a question he'd been carrying for several weeks and had decided it was time to ask. She was at the back work table with a length of heavy canvas, cutting pattern pieces for a set of work pants someone had ordered. She looked up when he came in. He took his hat off. He'd gotten a new hat, finally, in October, so she'd pointed out that the storm-repaired one had developed a new structural problem, and he'd resisted replacing it for longer than was reasonable. The new one was similar in style but darker, with a brim that sat level. She'd noticed when he first wore it and had not said anything about it, which he'd found amusing. "I want to marry you," he said. He said it plainly, the way he said the things he'd thought through carefully. "I'm not asking because the timing is good, or because the town expects something, or because it would be convenient for either of us. I'm asking because you are the person I want to go through the next years with, the hard ones and the ordinary ones." He paused. "I know it's not a speech." "I don't want a speech," she said. She set down the scissors. She looked at him. The look she'd been giving him since the beginning. The one that saw a person rather than a category. The one that had arrested him in the alley behind her workroom on a day he'd had no particular expectations. She thought about what a yes would mean, the practical tangle of 2 lives becoming one operation, her shop and his ranch, and the ongoing and imperfect business of 2 difficult people deciding to be difficult in the same direction. She thought about the mountain and the stone channel and the cold nights in the basin and the way he'd said her name when something needed to be understood between them and words were the right tool. She thought about the fact that she was 31 years old and had built something real with her own hands in a place that had tried to convince her she couldn't, and that the man in front of her was the only person who had ever looked at what she'd built and seen the work in it rather than the limitations around it. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that she understood was the held tension of a man who'd told himself he wasn't nervous and had been wrong. "Good," he said. She picked up her scissors again. "There's a coat I have to finish by Thursday." "I know," he said. He put his hat on and sat down on the stool near the door, the one he'd claimed informally over months of visits. "I'll stay out of the light." What? They were married in December, before the worst of the winter came in a small ceremony at the county registry office with Dean and Clara as witnesses, and Roy Heller standing in the back because he'd happened to be in town on an errand and had decided in his way to stay. Afterward, Clara made a dinner at the ranch that was far more elaborate than she'd indicated it would be, which was characteristic of her. And Dean gave a toast that was one sentence long and managed, in that sentence, to say everything. Eliza moved most of her working life to the ranch over the following weeks. Not all of it. She kept the shop on the main street because the shop was hers, and she intended it to remain so, and she rode into town 4 days a week to work it. Cole didn't suggest she do otherwise. He understood what the shop meant without having to be told, because he understood what a thing you'd built yourself meant, and because he was the kind of person who had enough respect for that to keep his hands off it. What she brought to the ranch was herself, which turned out to be considerable. She was not a rancher. She'd never pretended to be. But she was practical and observant and had the kind of mind that looked at a system and found the inefficiencies in it. And over the following year, she found several in the way the ranch's accounts were being managed and the way the water distribution from the reservoir was being coordinated across the valley ranches. And she fixed them in the quiet, methodical way she fixed things. Cole watched this happen with something close to relief, not because he'd needed saving, but because there is a particular ease that comes from sharing a life with someone who approaches problems the same way you do. And he hadn't known he was carrying the weight of going at things alone until it was distributed differently. The valley changed in smaller ways and larger ways in the 2 years after the reservoir was restored. 4 families who'd been on the edge of abandoning their claims stayed, because the water situation was viable again. One family that Selby had nearly pressured into selling, the Bodines, expanded their operation instead. The ranchers' collective water agreement, which Cole and Grayson and Heller had drafted together the spring after the barn meeting, held through 2 subsequent dry seasons and was eventually formalized with the county. Eliza had edited the draft language of the agreement in the practical way of a person who reads things carefully and notices when words mean something other than what the writer intended. There was a moment about 18 months into the marriage when Cole was fixing a section of fencing on the north boundary and Eliza came to find him. She'd ridden out from the house because she had a question about the water schedule that needed answering before she could finish a letter she was writing to the county office. He was working with pliers and wire, and his hands were full, and she sat on her horse and asked the question, and he answered it, and she made a note in the small book she carried in her coat pocket, and then she didn't leave immediately. She sat there a moment, looking out over the north pasture where the grass was coming in good after the wet spring, where the creek ran through its cut with a sound you could hear from the fence line. "What?" he said, because he'd noticed her not leaving. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." He went back to the wire. She stayed a moment more. The truth was that she was thinking about the alley behind her shop and the hat in her hands, and the man who'd stood in her doorway looking slightly off balance because she'd simply talked to him like a person. She was thinking about how small that beginning was, how unremarkable, how ordinary. A dust storm and a piece of lost property, and a woman who'd fixed it because it was right there and needed fixing, not because she was calculating a return on the gesture. She'd learned in the years before Red Hollow to measure her actions carefully against what they were likely to cost her. Generosity had been a liability in the places she'd been before. It was something people took from you and used against you, evidence of availability rather than character. She'd learned to keep what she had close and give nothing away that she couldn't afford to lose. The hat had been a small rebellion against that. She'd seen it in the street after the storm, recognizable, damaged, and she'd thought, I can fix this. So she had. Without calculation, without expectation, without the careful weighing of what it might produce. She'd just fixed the thing because she knew how. And the thing it had produced, the man at her door, and the months of slow, honest conversation, and the mountain, and the water, and the 2 years of imperfect daily life built side by side with someone who saw her. None of that was what she'd calculated, because she hadn't been calculating. She'd been doing the work in front of her. She thought that this was probably the truest thing she knew about how a life gets built, not through the grand gestures, not through the dramatic reversals, but through the accumulated weight of small, honest actions done without expectation. The hat. The supply list on a piece of brown paper. The second day of stonework on a mountain when her knee hurt and the end of the channel felt unreachable. The letter to the fabric supplier. The coat made for the woman who'd told her to know her place, finished on time, done well, because the work was the work. You couldn't control what the town thought of you. You couldn't control whose brother-in-law ran the lumber yard or whose social architecture was organized against you. You couldn't control the drought or the people who saw it as an opportunity or the way the world arranged itself around power and who had it. What you could control was what you did with what was in your hands. And over time, if you did that honestly and without flinching, the thing you built with it had a weight that other things couldn't easily move. She'd learned this. She thought Cole knew it too, in the particular wordless way he knew things. Not as a philosophy, but as a practice, something he did rather than believed. It was one of the reasons she'd said yes. "I'm going back," she said, tucking the notebook into her pocket. "The letter needs to go out by afternoon." "Close the north gate on your way through," he said. Trace left it open again. "I will." She turned her horse. "Eliza?" She looked back. He was still working the wire, not looking at her. "The grass is good this year." "It is," she said. She rode back toward the house through the good grass and the thin winter light, and behind her Cole worked the fence line with his pliers, and the creek ran where it was supposed to run, and the valley was not perfect. It was never going to be perfect. It was a hard place full of difficult people with competing interests and long memories and the ongoing daily friction of lives lived in close proximity. But it was alive. And it was theirs, and they had both put their hands into the making of it. That was enough. In fact, it was more than enough. It was the whole thing.